This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
I'm glad you said that, because the studies that I have read show that there's very little uptake in terms of pronunciation instruction in the classroom. Which brings me back to a question, because I think both of you have talked about this, measuring intelligibility.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the methods you use to objectively, because I know people are going to be asking this, how can you objectively measure intelligibility in your students? And how can you use these assessments to guide your teaching in the classroom?
If you can listen and write it down, the person has been intelligible. So a dictation type activity is one way of doing it. If your students in a classroom come from different backgrounds, for example, so you might have a Turkish L1 student paired up with, I don't know, a Japanese L1 student. And if they can dictate to each other and write down successfully what the other person has said, then they're being intelligible to each other. Another is close, where you listen to a person speaking and you've got the text, but there's gaps. And if you can fill in the gaps just by listening once, that person's been intelligible. It's not as complete. And you can ask true, false type questions. So these are the things, at least that I picked up from reading around the work of Dowing and Monroe, that researchers into applied linguistics use as the tests. And the simplest is, can you write down what the person has said? And that doesn't require preparation, so it's easy to use in the classroom. Whereas if you go down the pathway of close or true false, then you have to prepare some questions, or you have to prepare a closed grid.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Even the act of setting them off to do a typical, B2, C1 level problem-solving task. If they solve the task, they've clearly been intelligible to each other. It doesn't require any more testing.
And it's so powerful as well. That type of activity is so powerful, because they see immediately when someone hasn't understood them. It's such a great activity for demonstrating international intelligibility. They get that immediate feedback either through facial expressions or requests for repetition. But they get it when they do this activity. It's so powerful.
And what's also powerful about the activity is, because of what Gemma says, that you see from your interlocutors' faces that you've not been intelligible. It forces you to look at your pronunciation and have another go. And there are examples from Jenny's data, from her field data, of her watching students in London doing these pair work tasks that are so typical of B2 and C1 level exams. And suddenly discovering no one's understood them, and doing a little rethink. What do I normally pronounce wrongly? And then pronouncing it again in a different way, and seeing the faces light up again. And this is wonderful, because this negotiation of meaning, or this accommodating the way you speak to make yourself more intelligible, is another of the skills that's required, that was not required previously, because we'd all be speaking with one accent and we'd all be perfect in that one accent. But the world doesn't speak English with one accent. And therefore your accent might be perfectly fine in Europe, and you've been around Europe doing your job and your accent's done great. And you fly out to Southeast Asia and you suddenly go, oh boy, I thought I spoke really, really clear English, but I need to do some modifications here because these guys don't understand me. And we can do that in class, which is what Gemma was describing. It's very powerful. However, you can't do it in classes in the context that I work in, because my students all have Spanish as their first language. So when they find that they're not understanding each other in English, they modify their English back towards Spanish until it's so Spanish that they may as well be speaking Spanish.
Spanglish.
And I remember watching this happen in front of my very eyes, and they were doing pair work about giving directions. So one student whose pronunciation was pretty good said, "Go down the road." And the other student said, "Okay, go down the road." "The qué?" "The road." "Ah, the road." See, yeah, go down the road. Well, road would not work outside that classroom.
Yeah.
So what's interesting here is that these communication activities are totally brilliant for teaching pronunciation if we have mixed L1 backgrounds
Mm-hmm.
working with each other. And they're very detrimental to pronunciation if everyone shares the same L1 background. That's something that's not being really picked up on in English language teaching.
Yeah,
We
I
went
agree.
so big in the 80s. We went so big on these communication activities. But in many, many places around the world, the victim of the communication activity was the student's pronunciation,
Mm-hmm.
which went deeper and deeper and deeper back towards the mother tongue pronunciation.
Right. No, Gemma, go ahead.
Robin, you once talked about this very issue, and you mentioned, and again, we know that AI is far from perfect, certainly in terms of listening and understanding all of us. But something I think you mentioned, and if I'm not wrong, Robin, was these websites or apps where you can be transcribed, your speech can be transcribed. Am I remembering this right correctly, Robin?
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be not a perfect alternative if you're in a monolingual environment, but it can be an option to try. Yeah. If the computer has not understood the student and it's come up with the wrong transcription, again, they get this immediate feedback. Okay, maybe I have to reformulate and make this clearer. So that can sometimes be an alternative. But of course, nothing is perfect as yet in terms of transcribing human speech. So
I started leaving messages on my phone, and then got these apps that will write the message. They transcribe it for you. And I thought there's huge potential here. And you're right, it's not going to be perfect because sometimes the message that it would transcribe was just not what I'd said. And I'm going, oh, wow, I'm a native speaker and I know, my pronunciation fine. So the app's the problem, but it will get better.
So interesting, right? Because you answered a lot. I was going to ask, and you guys have just given a really perfect answer, I think, about self-assessing or students self-assessing their own pronunciation, and how adept have you found them to be at that? Because traditionally, as you told the story, Robin, about 8 out of 10 student is surprised. We're the teachers doing the assessing, and the student generally will just say, "Oh, thank you, that's great." But you also used the word empower earlier, and I think a self-assessment in multilingual settings, you gave a good example. In monolingual settings, how can we go as teachers go about, or how have you found how effective, or at all, maybe not at all, are students at self-assessing their own pronunciation?
My experience was that they were tough on themselves. Hence the 7, 8, and 9 attempts before they got like, I don't have any more time. I've got to hand something in. I'll give them attempt number 6. It's the best I can do. I found my students excessively tough on themselves, and I needed to show them, ease up, ease up. You guys are good. You're doing a fine job, but they didn't have many opportunities to self-assess, and I was happy that they were working in groups and therefore getting peer feedback, because that's also incredibly powerful.
Have you seen them be able to measure their improvement?
Yes, because they're doing well. The system's evolved, and in the end, they would be doing 4 or 5 recordings during the year, and then they would go back and listen to the first recording and sometimes be massively embarrassed. Oh my God, did I hand that in? Hey, you did? Oh, it's terrible. Can't I do it again? No, you can't, because I've got to stop marking and go and have a life. But don't be embarrassed. It's fine. There's the mark. You got a 6, you got a 7, or whatever. The recording is really interesting because it can, and we mentioned this in the book, you can work into portfolios. Students would have a sequence of digital recordings of themselves that would go through the year. And if you wanted, you could hold one exercise or dialogue or monologue as constant, and through the year they'd have to do it again and again and again, and therefore they'd have a single dialogue with which they can refer back and see progress, plus other monologues and dialogues that they would do because they're pertinent to that particular moment in the year.
Right.
Okay.
But they can also, in their portfolio, bring in videos of people that they've heard who have the same mother tongue background, who are clearly successful in life, and who still sound Spanish, or still sound Turkish, or still sound Japanese. So they can build up a little sort of set of recordings of people they feel they could emulate. They could even make
Another really wonderful.
Go on,
Sorry,
Gemma.
Robin, I was going to say, just another thing that we talked about and we've mentioned in the book as well, one of the most wonderful things about the recordings is it's private, it's or it's a limited audience.
Yeah.
And that's something that is, again, it's very powerful because you remove the fear factor, something that John Levis said about pronunciation. Pronunciation is the face of your speech. You know, it's so easy to hear if you're different, if you stand out. And a lot of students are really shy and timid and worried, anxious about their pronunciation. And when they know it's only you that's going to be listening, or a chosen peer, you can just remove so much fear and anxiety that comes with pronunciation instruction and training. And I think that's it's why one of the reasons why I like this technique so much.
It sounds like a diagnostic, let's say. So we're recording at the beginning, middle, and end, so they can notice, some differences. And before Leo dives into the impetus of you guys writing the book, we spoke with Donna Brinton, as Leo mentioned earlier, for the last episode of the podcast. And we had a webinar with her actually as well. And she kind of was talking about some of the flaws in a traditional, let's say, audiolingual based speaking pronunciation diagnostic. Do you have, if a teacher's listening and they want to start to implement this in their classes, do you have a recommendation or a task of that original diagnostic of what could be with the concept of global English?
Yeah, I mean, teachers have to become familiar with the content of the Lingua Franca Core, but that's easy to access nowadays. And when we were writing the book for OUP, we added word stress because if you go right back to Jenny Jenkins' original work, she said there's not enough data to include it or exclude it. It's a gray area. And we still don't know enough about word stress and its impact on intelligibility, because some studies suggest it has none, and you can get the word stress wrong and be intelligible. And other studies say that lexical stress is actually important for intelligibility, even when it's international intelligibility. So for lack of data, we have included it. So that would be the Lingua Franca Core plus word stress. This is what teachers need to be able to check in their students.
So the Lingua Franca
Core, teachers need to know this, because then you can, once you know the elements of the Lingua Franca Core plus word stress, then you can listen to a recording a new student has given you and say, this student needs to work on this, 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 and this.
Right.
And word stress is often that kind of factor that really turns people off the Lingua Franca Core. They're like, well, how? Because I think we've all seen, we've all had anecdotes in the classroom where there's been a miscommunication because of incorrect word stress. And I think that for a lot of people, not having word stress in the Lingua Franca Core, despite this very valid reason that Jennifer Jenkins gave, we don't have conclusive evidence yet. That turns them off from the Lingua Franca Core. Well, if it doesn't include word stress, clearly it's not accurate. But I think, like Robin said, it's been this kind of middle ground that when we add it in, people are more receptive to it. And also it's this great stepping stone to introduce nuclear stress, which is also part of the Lingua Franca Core. So it can be this great introduction or first initial step into what this is.